we have the Chairman of International Care Ministries, Mr. David Southerland. Let's give him a warm round of applause.
Well, thank you very much. I've tried to speak during lunch before, and usually I think now the Philippines are the quietest eaters. So thank you very much for your hospitality. Let me introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Jokno, who's a professor of economics at UP. He was the budget secretary under the Estrada administration and an undersecretary under Cory Aquino's administration. He writes a regular column in Business World, which is one of the media sponsors here today, and he has pretty impressive academic credentials, 3 master's degrees and a PhD from Syracuse. So welcome, Dr. Jokno. We have also Dr. Habito, who is the chief of party of the Trade Project, which is the Trade Planning and Assistance for Development. That's a real mouthful. He was the Socioeconomic Planning Secretary under the Ramos administration. He teaches at Ateneo, and he writes for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, and he has a master's degree and a PhD from Harvard. So welcome. And also in the center, we have Dr. Sikat, who's a professor emeritus at the UP School of Economics. In the 1970s, he was the country's economic planner at the National Economic Council, and he was the first Director General of NEDA. And he writes for the Philippine Star. He spent 2 decades at the World Bank, and he has a PhD from MIT. So together, these 3 panelists have helped to chart the growth of the Philippine economy for nearly 3 decades. So I'm quite honored to be here. In comparison, I have to tell you that I'm feeling quite unqualified to be on the stage. I'm Dave Southerland. My one claim to fame is that I was the national debate champion of the United States in 1982. I started my career with Wall Street law firms in the U.S., and then I did a stint with the Clinton administration in the early 1990s. For the last 2 decades, I've lived in Hong Kong, and my most recent role was Morgan Stanley's chief financial officer in Asia, where I oversaw the financial affairs of a multi-billion-dollar business. And in that role, I personally put about 5 million miles on the airplanes. So for the last 2 decades, aside from Morgan Stanley, I've also been focused on the ultra-poor of the Philippines. And from 100 visits to this country, I've truly come to love this country. 3 years ago, I stepped away from the business world to focus on Philippine poverty full-time in my leadership of International Care Ministries. So when John Forbes asked me to moderate today, he asked me to inject 2 perspectives. First, the international viewpoint of how the Philippines fits into the global financial system, and secondly, a poverty viewpoint of how economic growth has impacted the poorest people in this country. So to introduce our topic today, let me just say, I think we should make no mistake. Sometimes people in these kind of forums complain about slow economic growth, but in fact, the Philippine economy has been booming, especially in second-tier cities. When I started making visits to the city of Bacolod in the 1990s, there were only a handful of quality restaurants. Now there's a new mall or a restaurant almost every month. And I see the same when I walk the streets of Dipolog or Iloilo or Tagbilaran or Jensan or Dumaguete. We witness changes in these cities almost every week. These cities are booming. But the Philippine growth does not always reach down to the poorest people, and my job today is to make sure that our panel keeps focused on how to create inclusive growth, not just growth in general, but growth that actually helps the poor. My role at International Care Ministries allows me to see the very bottom of the economic ladder. There remains about 12 million Filipinos who live in extreme poverty, and 7 million of those Filipinos, they live in ultra poverty. That is people who live on less than 50 US cents per person per day, or 22 pesos. What does that level of poverty look like? We've gathered more than 50 million data points from ultra-poor Filipino participants. The average income of an ICM participant is only 14 pesos per person per day. 32% of all of ICM mothers have had one of their own children die. 40% are seriously ill at any given time. 22% go to bed hungry and at least once a week, and 40% of these people have no electricity. It's haunting to realize that millions and millions of Filipinos have to endure these sorts of conditions every day. And even with our best intentions, it is easy for people like us to begin to forget what those people endure. So just look around the room today, the teapots and the lighting and things. So to help us to focus on that, the conference organizers agreed that I should take a couple of minutes to introduce you to an actual Filipina whose name is Maria. Maria lives in a remote village about an hour outside of Escalante in northern Negros. She has 8 children. Her home is so remote that the kids have to take a boat to get to school. This is a picture of Maria's actual home and all the people who sleep inside that home every night. Their walls are made out of plastic sacks. Her family has no electricity. They have no CR. They have to walk for 10 minutes in order to get water. Maria's husband, Levi, is a sugarcane laborer. In good times, he earns about 500 pesos per week for the entire family. But when it's not harvest season, he makes a lot less. Maria tries to sell shrimps down at the local pier, but it's unreliable income. And if you divide that family's income between the 6 family members, their average income is just 15 pesos per person per day. They go to bed hungry several times every week, week after week after week. Maria, who only finished elementary school, she desperately wants her kids to graduate from high school, but she has no money for the boat, so her children are often absent from school. She's afraid that these kids who she loves so deeply may drop out of school, just like every other one of her extended family members. And if those kids do drop out of school, then this cycle of ultra poverty will be repeated for yet one more generation. Now that's a little bit of an overwhelming story, isn't it? And it afflicts millions of people in this country. But Maria is not unusual. She's actually richer than the average person that goes through an ICM program. Now, in the face of such massive suffering, it's hard to know how to respond. So at ICM, we've created, through a decade of trial and error in the Philippine slums, we've pioneered a 4-month community education program we call Transform. And the average ultra-poor person who graduates from Transform experiences a 101% increase in household income, 28% fewer of them live with serious illness, there's a 36% reduction in those who go to bed hungry, and there are scores of other improvements as well. And Transform has specifically changed Maria's life. She now sells banana chips, she sells puto cakes around her sitio, and her income has more than doubled. And she is right on exactly the average person that goes through ICM's program. She is now able to send her kids to school every morning. She can put 3 nutritious meals on the table every day. She joined a micro savings group. She uses her savings to pay for her kids to graduate from school, and her kids now have a real chance of making it through high school. Now, Maria's family, they are still poor, but they have hope. Hope to achieve what they thought was impossible. And hope was the catalyst that kick-started their new life. At ICM, we dream of bringing hope to every ultra-poor person in the Visayas and Mindanao. And our dream, we think, is realistic. In a few months, we will graduate our 750,000th family member from our 4-month Transform program. That means that we have already reached 1/3 of all of the ultra-poor people in our 17 target provinces. We also know that these sorts of direct interventions, though, are never going to be the complete solution to the struggles of ultra-poverty. The poor need their country to grow economically, and they need that growth to include them. So today we have 3 extraordinary panelists, and my job is to make sure that we keep that conversation focused not only just on economic growth for the whole country, but on how to make inclusive growth in particular. So how can we develop the economy of this country so that millions of Filipinos like Maria will experience the benefits? So let me just start by just giving a couple of minutes to each of our panelists, and the question I'd like them to answer is, what policies would you recommend to the next president of the Philippines to help the poor people like Maria? So, Dr. Sikat, you want to start?
Thank you very much. The most important thing about inclusive policy is that it is contingent first on having the macroeconomic framework sufficiently stable. If that thing is not made stable by the next president, we get into problems that would that might even create problems for the future. So macroeconomics is important. But beyond that, it is to keep the economy in a competitive mode, to have enterprises within the country in a competitive situation. We made advances in this area already on one end, but there are major policy issues that need to be addressed. The main advance we have is the fact that the country is disciplined to some extent by each membership within the WTO. That thing assures that our industries will be competitive along the framework of ASEAN. Within the world economy. We have also the ASEAN creating another disciplining framework, which is the integrated, integrated market. But the next set of agenda is really a long agenda that has been around us for so many years because they refer to rigidities and inflexibilities in three major markets, the markets for the factors of production that economists talk about. One is that on capital. Capital policies regarding capital need to be improved. They have been improving, but they need to make a big jump. Secondly, we need to address the imperfections and rigidities in the labor market. Here, I will not elaborate, but this is a significant element of making the progress in employment creation possible. With improvements in investments, we can only get more employment if the volume of the quality of employment will rise. But the rigidities create a problem for the whole framework. Finally, we can refer to other policies. Maybe land is a major element, investment in land. And I will not mention that there are other important policies, but if the president, the next president, were to deal with these three major elements, he has his hands full. And the outcome will be major for creating new progress and greater inclusiveness in the results.
Great. Thank you very much. Dr. Chokno, how you want to share a few thoughts?
Sure. First things first. The best laid out plan won't work in the hands of incompetent and inexperienced men and women. So the first order of business of the next president is to assemble a few good men and women with experience and integrity and are willing to put in the hard work for the common good. Next, the president should empower the people that he chose. And this task should be done even before he takes his oath of office on June 30, 2016. Now, the next president should also put together a 6-year infrastructure plan. Not 10-year, not 20-year, 6-year. A 6-year human development plan, a 6-year poverty reduction plan, and a 6-year agricultural modernization plan. These plans should be done within the first 100 days. The next president will soon find out that he does not have enough money to do all the things he wants to do. So he has to reform the tax system, whose tax effort is not more than 14%. Therefore, he should instruct his finance secretary designate to form a panel of tax experts, not more than 5, to prepare a list of tax changes in order to make the Philippine tax system higher yielding, efficient, easier to administer, and competitive with our ASEAN neighbors. A report should be done before September 2016. Now, we need to reform some restrictive economic provisions in the Constitution in order to bring in foreign investments. Therefore, the President should instruct the Executive Secretary designate and the Economic Secretary designate to assemble a panel of advisors, not more than 15, to study and recommend what economic provisions in the Constitution need to be amended. And this task should be done within 60 days. Now, in the meantime, the President should send to the next Congress an urgent request for the convening of a constitutional convention. The work of the CONCON should be done by March 2017, and a referendum may be called in 2 months after. All these initiatives call for close working relationship between the President and Congress. And this can be met if the President is willing to convene regularly the LEDAC. That's all. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Dr. Habito, you want to share some thoughts?
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. Well, let me zero in on the question, how do we make our economic growth more inclusive? And I think everybody realizes it's all about jobs and livelihoods. The problem is we have had very dynamic economic growth, but it's not translating to enough jobs to employ still more than 2 million jobless Filipinos. I think right now the figure stands at about 2.3 million. By the way, we've come a long way since it was about 2.9 million a couple of years ago. So we have, in fact, made some gains there. But what would I advise the next president, particularly to make our economic growth benefit a lot more Filipinos? Well, first, I guess we have to figure out what are the sectors and industries in the economy whose growth would in fact lead to maximum benefits to everybody. And these sectors and industries are the ones which, of course, create the most jobs. And secondly, whose growth will bring along a lot of other domestic sectors and industries with it. In other words, sectors that have strong interlinkages, whether forward or backward linkages, with other domestic industries. And here, I won't be saying anything that people haven't heard already. Agriculture, tourism, and manufacturing appear to be those sectors of our economy which are most strongly linked with the rest of the domestic economy. And of course, in agriculture, we have been doing so miserably. It's not even growing fast enough to catch up with population growth. Clearly, a lot of attention has to be given there. Agriculture and agribusiness, and how it ties all the way to industries, in fact. So that, in fact, shows that agriculture and manufacturing can very much be intimately tied together in our next economic strategy that will look at these sectors that will bring the most benefits to everybody. Now, the other element there is the competition environment. And that's why I've welcomed the fact that we now have a competition law after 27 years of waiting. And this will hopefully help level the playing field, as we all like to say, so that the small enterprises can play a much stronger role in our economic development. And that brings me to the third aspect, which is precisely that, small enterprise development. We simply have to get our economy to be one wherein small enterprises, from micro to small to medium, participate a lot more and benefit a lot more from the growth of the economy. So if they are able to contribute more, the SMEs can contribute more to job generation, to our GDP in general, and to our exports in particular, then indeed we can be certain that our economic growth will permeate more widely to the rest of the Filipinos around. So just to summarize then, it's really agriculture, manufacturing, tourism, what I call the inclusive growth sectoral drivers in our economy, the competition environment, which the competition law and the new Philippine Competition Commission hopefully will ensure will be providing us a level playing field, especially for the small players. And third, of course, small and medium enterprise development.
Fantastic. Those are really great overviews of, from all three of you. So maybe we've had some conversations beforehand. Perhaps we can delve a little bit deeper into a few of the topics. Dr. Sikat, you wanted to talk a little bit about the reform of the labor laws and what you would see that the Philippines should be doing?
Yes, the labor laws have developed into very...
you need to bring it closer to you.
Labor laws have developed into into very protective laws for the laborers who are employed, but they have really created a problem for generating more jobs. One reason is that it has been based on the idea that we should use government power to raise periodically the minimum wage. The minimum wage is fine if it is tied up with more market indicators of what the true wage is for people who want to look for jobs. But because of the orientation of the laws that we have, we have a problem of this thing being highly protected for the employed labor. And then, of course, there are many other problems associated with it. The idea that you cannot fire workers easily. These are very populist ideas, and they, of course, are very difficult to work on. But somehow there ought to be a measure by which the government or the president has to look at the job generation issue. I have not seen it being played up very much, except from the viewpoint that jobs will be created in this country. Unless we work on the labor laws issues, creating more suitable alternatives, we will have a definite problem. One alternative that I had suggested, in fact, might be one way of dealing with the problem. If we can create a situation where we have special labor zones, where the idea that specific labor laws can be suspended for a while, except that you have the need for social security and other kinds of very important social laws being protected within the system. Here is an opportunity by which the government can encourage the inflow of more investments in more labor-intensive types of industries. We have lost this to the other countries, and that is one of the problems why, in spite of the fact that we are generating new investments, we are leaving a lot of the workers dumped into the area where there is where the informal sector is the only place where they can work. Reducing that area of employment problems is a key issue for any president. And if he succeeds in that, we will succeed in creating more inclusive growth.
Great, thank you. You want to add any thoughts?
No, I wanted to pick up on the minimum wage, which is one of the shall we say, restrictive policies that Dr. Sikat just mentioned. There's two things about that I'd like to say. One is, whenever we talk about setting the minimum wage, I think few people realize that we're actually going to be helping only about half, or even less than half, of all the workers in the economy. Because the statistics do tell us that in the labor force, the employed labor force, only about 49% are wage and salary workers. The rest are either self-employed workers or unpaid family workers. So anytime you just try to make adjustments on the wage rate, you're helping actually less. By the way, I haven't even counted in the denominator the 2.3 million unemployed. So it's really less than half of our workers who will benefit. And secondly, of course, we know that by raising minimum wages beyond what, shall we say, is the equilibrium or the market wage, we will end up even raising unemployment even further. Now, the second part of it is that really wages are again addressed to employed workers, when we should be looking also at how entrepreneurs or how livelihoods can be increased rather than just wage income. And I think one of the problems that we always have in this country is that young people aspire too much to be working for somebody else rather than creating work for others by aspiring to be entrepreneurs themselves. And I think if we can change that mindset, especially through our educational system, then our unemployment rate would not be as high as it has been. So again, just to point out that again, these wage policies have in fact been inadvertently part of our reasons for uninclusiveness of our growth.
Dr. Jacno, do you want to, I don't know if you want to say anything about the labor, but maybe just generally about business, empowering business?
Well, Shiel mentioned three areas: agriculture, manufacturing, and tourism. I agree. Those are labor-creating industries, but you need the following in order to make those things dynamic. Infrastructure, okay? You need public infrastructure, and you also need to reduce the cost of doing business in this country. And so infrastructure, we've been spending something like 2% of gross domestic product, when in fact we should be spending something like 5 to 7% because we're catching up. And that means that you modernize agriculture. You facilitate the movement of goods from one island to another island. On the cost of doing business, I just learned, because one of our problems right now is power supply. But to be able to put up a power plant, you need something like 200 permits. Can you imagine that? 200 permits. You need about 2 years to get all this. A power plant that could be constructed within 3 years will take about 5 years because of the bureaucratic requirements.
Dr. Seacat, what would you like to add on this topic?
Well, yes. We can talk, I've been most concerned about generating labor, employment. It's not only employment, but the quality has to be of a sustained character. In other words, people should have employment from year to year, if not every 6 months or every 2 months, not seasonal. The way to do that is, of course, to raise the quality of investments coming into the country. And the quality of investments imply that we must generate demand for labor that is sufficiently large. How do we do that? To me, the problem has been rather simple. But over the decades, it has been a major problem that has not been solved. Because the root cause of all of this is linked to a design in the past about old ideas of nationalism. The fact that only Filipinos should control the destiny of the domestic market. And so we restricted a lot of these major industries. And through the constitutional provisions we had in 1933, we created additional problems of more restrictive policies affecting industry. Let me talk about, for instance, the issue of PESA incentives as against BOI incentives. You know, the BOI is the Board of Investment. PESA is the Philippine Export Economic Zone Authority. Most of the investments from foreign countries are in the PESA. A few are given by the BOI. And all the incentives that are in the BOI are basically what? Basically for domestic enterprises. With the government having gone into new era for competitiveness, we are part of WTO, we are part of the integrated market for ASEAN. The idea of restricting the home market only for Filipinos becomes rather wrong. Why? Because foreign companies based in Malaysia, in Singapore, anywhere else, among our neighbors, they will be able to enter our market. And this is one reason why Philippine domestic enterprises that have been protected over time have lost out because they needed protection too much. The point that they're now in a more competitive mode will help. But more important is that we ought to increase the mass of foreign direct investments that are directed to help the domestic economy. Because there is a big hollow in the trading between FDI-located PESA locators and the domestic economy. The FDIs in the PESA, they only get their raw materials and imports from the other countries. They're not getting them from the Philippines. If we had a more developed local economy in which we have suppliers supplying basic goods that are destined for the Philippine economy as well as the world, we can integrate the local economy with the PESA economy, and we will have a more progressive, higher demand for labor in this country. And those permanent employment that I talk about, higher quality, will create a much higher per capita income, family income for all those laborers employed within the system.
Yeah. Very helpful. You want to say something?
Well, let me pick up on a couple of points that were said by both Ben and Jerry. Sounds like ice cream. Infrastructure, sorry, and foreign investments. Infrastructure and foreign investments. I mean, again, Ben is right that infrastructure has been a very constraining factor to our further growth, in fact, even putting aside inclusive growth. But one important reason that we're also making it more difficult for us to put the infrastructure together, in spite of the public-private partnerships program, or PPP, is that, again, our restrictive constitutional provisions is preventing the big infrastructure providing companies abroad from even participating fully in our PPP program. And that's why, as we all say, whenever there is a big PPP project, it's usually the same familiar names who are bidding for it. And there's very minor participation by foreign companies. We don't have enough of a choice. We don't have enough of competition in this area. And therefore, lack of competition also essentially leads to, in the end, higher cost. And that's part of the reason why our costs are so much higher. Of course, everybody laments the slow internet in this country and how apparently it's reputed to be the slowest in this region already, or slowest in Asia even. Clearly, everybody agrees it's because of lack of competition in that particular sector. So we have to really open up those counterproductive, restrictive policies that have kept more competition, especially from foreign investors, from coming in and providing these basic prerequisites of more growth, let alone inclusive growth, which is, of course, infrastructure.
Dr. Jargno, you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, in fact, I was saying the next government can put in place an infrastructure plan for the next 6 years, and he doesn't even have to reinvent the wheel. The PPP has a long list of projects, and can you imagine if all those 50 PPP projects will be bid out? Who's going to bid out without the foreign direct investments? Right? That's really constraining the economic provisions in the Constitution.
Good. Well, so today we did want to try to focus on inclusive growth. And 70% of all the poor people in this country are in the more rural areas. And so when you get outside the NCR, then often it's driven by agriculture, and land reform is an important part of that. And so this country has had a comprehensive land reform policy in place for a while. I just wonder if some of you would like to weigh in on the wisdom of land reform, whether this is the right direction for the country or not.
Well, we are already there. It's very hard to really say we are in the wrong direction, but I think it would have been better if we did not go into a comprehensive land reform program, that we had gone into just delimited areas for land reform. If we were to follow the Taiwan, Japanese, or South Korean model of land reform, we should have been there a long, long time ago, finished with land reform. Then the country would have been in a much better framework to deal with the true problems of investments in agriculture, in industry, and commerce. But we went all throughout, even creating land reform for forestry areas, which is quite an interesting expansion of the program. The main land reform has created enormous uncertainty in the past, and it has deterred investments in agriculture enormously. There is another element here. The idea about limitations of the constitutional provisions against foreign capital in various areas. It has affected participation, although not totally, in agriculture, which is a major area where output development could have created a higher level of productivity in various forms of investments in agriculture. Now, that's why I believe that opening up to major factors of production would be more helpful, not only to those who are inside. Initially they They get worried about participation of new factors. But eventually, when they discover that improving productivity raises everyone's welfare, that is a good seller for the whole system.
We've been doing land reform for the last more than half a century, okay, since the first Macapagal administration. We've spent so much money for services rather than real asset redistribution. And if you look at the performance of agriculture, it has been below population growth rate. And so I would, if I have to put a verdict on it, I would say it's a failure, agrarian reform. As we modernize agriculture, we need bigger farms, not smaller farms.
Yeah. So I know when I'm in the province and I'm talking to the sugar barons or people that have owned large tracts of land, and I ask them about agriculture, they would say that one of the biggest inhibitions from their perspective in them investing more in their businesses has to do with land reform. So Dr. Abito, I think that you have done some research around whether land reform actually benefited the poor. Is that right?
Well, land reform, where it was done right, actually did help the beneficiaries. But the problem really is that one of the very basic rationales for going into it, which was the premise that land ownership would give the poor farmers better access to credit because they now have a bankable asset, actually did not play out. The problem is we thought that land ownership, land redistribution was the key. And I've become inclined to think that we were barking up the wrong tree. It was really the support we were giving the farmers, whether or not they owned the land. And again, when they got the land, the expectation was they would be able to borrow from the banks. In the end, we realized that the banks would not accept agricultural land as security or as collateral for loans. So that purpose was defeated. And so the farmers did not get any better off. They didn't have the wherewithal to actually improve their productivity. And again, that was because of the failure to provide them the needed support services to become more productive farmers. So in the end, I suspect that it's been a misplaced obsession with redistributing land ownership when it's really more of the actual technical support that we give to farmers that we've been failing in.
Yeah, so one of the aspects of creating inclusive growth is investing in the labor force and sort of human development. And in the last 15 to 20 years in the world, this whole concept of conditional cash transfer has really exploded. 20 years ago, there was hardly any of this anywhere in the world. Then Brazil and Mexico were successful, and then it kind of, I think now it's happening in 62 countries around the world. The Philippines is actually one of the biggest users of conditional cash transfers in the world. There's about a little more than 4 million households in the CCT now, which a projection across the size of the population, that's talking about 20 million people. That's 20% of the entire country. 10 million students in this country are in families that benefit from the CCT program. So, it's quite a large investment, and I just wonder, Dr. Jokno, you want to give us your thoughts about the CCT program?
Well, as you said, CCT is a good program, but its impact is long-term. I think anybody who expects a miracle out of it in the short term, that's unfounded. However, in our country, social services is a devolved function. It's the responsibility of local governments, provinces, cities, municipalities. And given that there are some 7,200 islands in the Philippines, it's difficult to govern from the center. And so that's my disagreement with this program. I think if we want to go forward, I think we should involve the elected local officials in this program, rather than concentrating the 60+ billion portfolio in one hand, who's not even elected.
Okay. Dr. Sikat, you want to say something about the CCT?
Well, I've always thought that the CCP should not be designed as a permanent kind of support. It is a subsidy for the very poor, but it is likely to be one that should be eased out as we conquer the main problem of development, which is to create employment in this country. Unless we work along the lines of creating demand for labor which is sufficiently large to absorb the labor that is there waiting to be employed into gainful employments, we will have a CCT program that might become a permanent subsidy. And that is not, I think, the design of the World Bank or any other institution that has pushed the CCT as a useful framework for creating temporary support. CCT should really be seen as a program that should be phased out, but maybe in the next few years, it should still be there. If the president should really work, the new president should really work on the improvement of the employment framework, the business economy, so that the country will be able to move out of very large subsidy programs.
Well, on CCT, again, just like the rest, I agree that this should not be seen as a dole-out program, as too many critics seem to think it is. It is an investment in the future of the family. It is something that incentivizes the family to invest in their own future through their children, through their education. So in that sense, it is in fact a good investment. And indeed, it's been paying off. I mean, in other countries where they've done this, the World Bank has documented how it has indeed uplifted the lives of the families in a more sustainable way. Now, the thing I also like to say about CCT is that for the first time, we have a targeting system that I think is doing the right thing. We have the National Household Targeting System, the so-called NHTS, that comes with the implementation of the CCT. Before, we had a problem with targeting our assistance to the poor. A study by the Philippine Institute for Development Studies measured as much as 80% of diversion, of mistargeting, meaning assistance going to the wrong people, and as much as 60% undercoverage, meaning as much as 60% of the deserving not getting this assistance. But with the NHTS, which was done very carefully by the DSWD, to their credit, I think we can be confident now that the CCT is going to the right families. Of course, it's not perfect. Clearly, there have been leakages here and there. And this is the kind of system that at least has an objective basis for targeting. I may disagree a little bit with Ben on this because, as you know, a lot of people don't trust all of the LGUs to be doing this targeting well, especially the very politicized local executives who will choose their own cronies, so to speak, as the beneficiaries for this kind of a program. But being based on a very objectively developed targeting system that really looks at the circumstances of each family beneficiary, then in fact, it may be doing a good thing.
But what I have in mind is that the identification of the beneficiary should be done through the system. But the administration should be in partnership with local officials, local governments, so that there will also be ownership on the part of the local officials.
Maybe I can just weigh in a little bit of our experience in this area. We do see many millions of the poor, and I would say that the CCT program has been phenomenally helpful in the lives of the people that we've seen. That in fact the CCT program has been phenomenally well targeted. I would say that it doesn't get everyone. Only about 25% of the people that we work with are actually in the CCT program. But the reason why our guys are not in is usually they don't have birth certificates, they don't have marriage certificates, they're not recognized in the government system. So there is a level of people that are below what the government has yet targeted. But I think that the government has issues around has programs to get down there. And I think compared to the other 60 countries around the world, the Philippines is recognized as being one of the best in the world at actually finding the poorest people. So, you know, I think that's been quite good. The other social program that I think doesn't get as much press but is quite powerful for the country is PhilHealth. And a health disaster in a poor family just can crush the economy of that family. So and the existence of PhilHealth is so very important. Now there are still some issues around coverage. About half of our participants do have PhilHealth and half of them don't. The aspiration is to try to get all of them onto PhilHealth. But I wonder if any of you have any comments you want to make about the health coverage.
Well, I think the biggest challenge now continues to be the accessibility of health services. I mean, I've visited Tawi-Tawi a couple of times, for example. There, if you get seriously sick, there's no way you can get the right help. You have to be brought to Zamboanga City to get the right medical attention. So we have to be able to provide the minimal level of hospitals that are needed in every major part of the country, especially the more remote ones like Tawi-Tawi and all the other remote areas in northern and southern Luzon, southern Philippines, I mean. So I think what needs to be done, first and foremost, is to ensure that the health services through health centers equipped with the minimum required to be responsive to the needs of the local population are provided for in every municipality and if possible in every barangay in the country.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, in one of our quite good-sized provinces, not Tawi-Tawi, but a good-sized province, the public hospital has not had any anesthesia for 2.5 months to do any surgeries at all. And in another one, also a good-sized provincial hospital, they only scheduled to do 2 elective surgeries for the entire province every month. And so, that access to medical care, I mean, the quality of the medical care is something that the country needs to definitely work on. Anything else?
I guess it has something to do with the performance indicators. Because if you use as indicator number of local government units with where there's access, rather than the number of cards issued, that makes a lot of difference.
Well, perhaps just one last topic here is around education. So trying to target the Philippine education system to maximize success for the next generation. I wonder if any of you want to say anything about that. Dr. Sikat?
I think the recent move of the government to improve overall education is one of the major achievements of the current president. The K-12 program raises the amount of schooling. This is, of course, being objected to by people who want to get their children out of school, no matter what. The quality of education has to improve, not only from the viewpoint of more years of schooling, but from the viewpoint of investing in teachers. Teachers are important, and so the fact that the educational effort, the effort to raise the budget of the school system, the public school system, is a move in the right direction. It is, in fact, a feature of Philippine effort that we find that there are many literate Filipinos, and that's why they disappear here and go elsewhere and work abroad. They're more easily accepted. But I think the more important thing is to create a deeper sense of making the educational system responsive to the needs of a growing economy. And the move to have the TESDA attend to some of these problems and to continue improving that, I think, is a good direction. Apprenticeship issues should be encouraged because in apprenticeships, we create better laborers, better skills. It's the attention to the private educational system, the tertiary level, is some thing that I think is also worth observing. The current involvement of major industrial groups in acquiring some tertiary educational system, this is a useful development. So encouraging this should be needed. But there is one problem about the educational sector. Still, we have the problem of the constitutional provisions. Here, I think this is another, I might say, silly consequence of the extremes of nationalism. Why would we prevent good universities from investing in our educational system if they come from abroad? The trick, recently, Singapore has become a major center, whereas before they were not involved in much education. Malaysia has done a very good job in making the tertiary system a very important element of investments for the improvement of the high-level learners within society. So I think opening the economy, the educational sector to more investors is a good direction.
Yeah, and from our perspective, we've seen really quite dramatic change in the country. A decade ago, there was so many of the poor children were not in school at all. And now, not only has it been from the 10 years of education, adding kindergarten, adding 11th and 12th grades, not just that, but also just getting so many more children into the educational system has been really quite obvious in the programs that we operate in. But I would say that perhaps one of the big problems is we still have more than half of the poor drop out of elementary school before they finish elementary school. So it's not so much about getting them in, but it's keeping them in. And then the other thing is actually allowing the private industry to expand the educational system. I think that the Philippines is quite unusual in the middle-income countries in essentially the animosity towards private education to try to help kids in this country. Anything you guys want to add?
I think the data would show that half of the college and college-trained students are unemployed, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe we're spending so much at that level. And given the huge requirement for the K-12 program, I think there should be a reallocation of resources on the part of the government.
Well, I think Doris mentioned it in the earlier panel about the need to link business and academe. Particularly, I'm talking about the higher end, the tertiary education, to avoid this job skills mismatch that everybody is lamenting. If there's closer interaction between industry and academe, then perhaps the kinds of students that are coming out of our tertiary higher education institutions would be better suited for the kinds of jobs that are waiting for them out there.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'll just close by saying we talked about the economic policies that the government can use, and then we talked about some of the human development policies. And economic progress clearly is the most important thing to freeing people from poverty, for sure. You know, China, when I got married 30 years ago, there was 70% of the population lived on less than $1 a day, and now it's less than 20%. And so that is almost the greatest impact on poverty reduction in human history, and it all happened through economic growth. So that's got to be the most important. But I think that there is also international consensus that you need to have some level of direct intervention in order to avoid suffering in the short term. The other thing I would just ask is perhaps those of you in the room, I do often hear Filipinos who are so pessimistic about the future of the Philippines. And I have to say, I think that that's quite misplaced. I think that it was only a couple of generations ago that the United States was in very serious poverty. My grandmother was pregnant 16 times. And 2 of her children died from scarlet fever before the age of 5. It's not that long since the United States has made change. And if you look back at the development histories of lots of countries, in a generation or 2, things can make a lot of difference. So I'm a real optimist about the future of the Philippines. Poverty reduction will be dramatic, but it will take some time to get done. So thank you all very much.
Thank you once again to our panelists. Mr. Southerland, Dr. Diokno, Dr. Habito, and Dr. Sikat, may we ask you to please come forward for a souvenir photo. Thank you. And now we move to panel 4, which is on modernizing infrastructure. Please welcome the Executive Director of the Australian-New Zealand Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, Mr. Ryan Evangelista.
Distinguished guests and members of the Joint Foreign Chambers, as well as the Philippine business organizations and friends of Arangkada, good day to all of you. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce this panel discussion, which is tasked to identify solutions for the next decade to address the challenge of poor infrastructure and provide adequate modern infrastructure. The importance of infrastructure has never been highlighted as much because earlier, as we noted in the previous sessions, it is a stimulus for economic growth and development. We will see from the slide, if it's available on the screen, or if you would like to go to page 65 of the assessment, according to the World Economic Forum, the Philippines has slipped into the position behind Vietnam among the ASEAN 6 economies for quality of infrastructure. This is despite the substantial progress made by the Aquino administration in doubling public spending on infrastructure to 5% of the GDP in 2016. When we break down the components of the WEF ranking, the Philippines is also in 6th position in terms of road, railroad, port, air, and power supply. That's on page 76 of the assessment. So the good news is that more infrastructure is being built, while the bad news is that it is far, far from being enough. And I have the honor of introducing our distinguished panelists and speaker who will provide their perspective on this important topic. Our speakers for this afternoon are two leading experts on infrastructure, one of which come from the private sector and the other one from the public sector. I'd like to call them on stage to join us. First is Mr. Eduardo Francisco, the President of BDO Capital and Investment Corporation. He will discuss our infrastructure needs for the next decade and how to meet them. And the second speaker is Undersecretary Cosette Canilao, the Executive Director of the PPP Center, who will provide hard facts on projects as well as recommendations to make the PPP program more dynamic. Our speakers will be joined by a distinguished panel, and they are as well experts in the subject matter. Our first panelist is Mr. Jesse Yang, the President or the Principal Investment Officer for PPP Transaction. Yes, Transaction Advisory Services of the International Finance Corporation. Just last week, the IFC hosted an all-day forum focused on Philippine PPPs. Joining Mr. Ang is Mr. Carl Lewis, the Country Manager of GHD, a global engineering services consulting firm, who will highlight the infrastructure policy note, which you can read as well in the assessment on pages 75 to 79. We'd also like to invite Mr. Eduardo Yap, Chair of the Traffic and Transportation Committee of the Management Association of the Philippines. Mr. Yap developed a comprehensive set of resolutions to our traffic problems. And we'd like to ask Mr. John Eric Francia, President and CEO of AC Infrastructure Holdings, an investor in power, rail, and toll projects. If he's around, please join us as well on stage. Welcome, Mr. Francia. And moderating this panel is another experienced practitioner, in fact, the first director of the BOT Center, which has been established some decades ago, or 2 decades ago. Former Undersecretary himself, Dr. Alan Ortiz, who is currently the President of SME Global Power. Thank you, our distinguished speakers and panel. We will now begin the session, and I'd like to call on stage Mr. Ed Francisco, President of the BDO Capital and Investment Corporation.
Thank you, Ryan. Can I have my slides loaded, please? Okay, where are my slides? There you go. I was asked, when I was asking John Forbes what to discuss, he said, Ed, it's okay. You're the icebreaker anyway after lunch, so I can challenge you, or he challenges me to wake you guys up. Next slide, please. So we were talking about what we wanted to do, I guess, not just for the next decade, but even when I was breaking this presentation a few days back, I was still even thinking what to do for the next 6 years. I think 6 years is even tough enough already, even when we make our projections. Next slide. So we wanted to do quickly, at least I have maybe 12 minutes left, where we are ranked today, and we all know that anyway, but I wanted to start with my wish list because since I'm working for the private sector, it's easy to say, I guess, what we wanted to see, and no one will hopefully get mad at what I say. Next slide. When we see our rankings anyway, we all know our rankings, and of course they've already improved, but as far as infrastructure is concerned, compared to our peers, we are way at the bottom. Okay, that's the Philippine ranking for overall. And then the next slide is for specific industries, for transport, and for infrastructure, it's also way down. This is just public information we got from the WEI, and it's available to everybody. Next slide. When we were looking at the amounts spent, of course, this is not a percent of GDP, but just in terms of notional amounts, I guess it also shows why our infrastructure is so poor, because when we look at the amounts we spend compared to our peers, it shows that we are really underspending. Okay, next slide. The nice thing about that is that while we are underspending, in the last few years, we also have to give recognition to the government that while GDP growth, I think, was around 5 or 6%, because I don't see my speech in front of me, so I cannot see my presentation. I apologize. There should be one in front, but I don't see it. That the infrastructure has been growing 5 times the growth of that of GNP. So at least you could see that there's been an improvement. And then what we also did, because again, I'm private sector, when we look at the PPP numbers, and I will not even touch on that because we're honored to have Cosette with us. We assume that the PPPs will be fully rolled out, okay? That's even a big task already. We assume that even if they're fully rolled out, when you look at the PPP number anyway, let's say it's 20 billion, to be conservative, I think we assume it will be rolled out in 3 years, spread out. You don't even start seeing the fruits of the PPP after maybe it's constructed, right? So we just spread it out. But when you look at this number, the PPP in itself, that's already spread out using the what's Cosette has in our website, is relatively insignificant compared to the total government infrastructure, which is surprising to me. So there really is a lot to be done, or that a lot can be done by the government. Next slide. So this was how it was spent, a lot of roads and bridges, and there was also a lot of buildings, just for some background. Next slide. And then I won't even go through this because, of course, Cosette will be here to discuss this. Next slide. Effectively, what it says, there are many projects for 2016 and going forward, which we hope that the new administration will continue, because there's been a lot of institutional building and lots of things that can be done. Next slide. Here, though, is at least in terms of the budget, so we wanted to show that what it would look like. There is a lot of potential that could happen if the balance, or if we maximize the 5% of GNP, right, or GNP GDP, plus we also are able to get the PPPs on way. That's around 700 billion pesos, right? Next slide. And here, I was just looking at 6 years. I was not even looking at 10 years because I don't want to even venture what will happen then. I'm just happy to hope that maybe the presidentiables take this, take the bull by the horns and do something about it. If we just assume, I think, very rough 6% growth, conservative. If we continue to spend 5% a year, the total for the next 6 years is 5 trillion pesos. Okay? It's an easy number to remember, 5 trillion. That is the 5% infrastructure needs. So I guess the next slide is, I guess when we talk about our wish list, and this, our next slide. Our wish list is, and then we were looking at some key assumptions. Of course, it varies. But as a baseline, because of course, a bridge costs very differently depending where it is, if it's underwater, it's under marshland, if it's reclaimed. A road, if it is already on land, or if it's going to be built over again or via aqueducts, it will change significantly. But we just use the numbers publicly available in the PPP. So I think we used 200 million pesos per kilometer of road, 2 billion pesos per kilometer of rail, using some of the rail projects that are being bidded out. From the smaller provincial airports, 5 billion pesos was some of the target amounts. For the bigger city project, excluding, of course, the NAIA big project, it's around 10 billion pesos. Okay, so if we had our wish list with that 5 trillion, if we can get our act together, and I guess that's the challenge really for Arangkada, because I don't have to preach to the choir. We all believe in the same things. We want the same things. But if we can preach to the government, imagine how many 1,000-kilometer roads more we can build. Because when I started going into infrastructure financing, I remember we only had 200 or 300 kilometers of toll roads. Imagine how many roads we can build. If the North Rail project is successful, and it will be successful, how much money we have more to spend to build more rail? How much for airports? How much for classrooms and hospitals? For flood control and for ports? And my assumption even here is that the private sector has been doing a great job, but also thanks to the government and thanks to what Alan has started in COSEP, because the private sector is already funding most of the power, right? We are also funding a lot of these other, and I guess in the broadband, I support Arangkada's views on increasing the broadband, and maybe Alan can talk about it later on, but if we can even have our own satellite to improve the broadband and the internet capability, that would really help, because that would position us more, at least make us more competitive. So we have the same views, and I think 5 trillion, if spent wisely, can do a lot. In fact, my culminating slide, the next slide, is just shows, I guess, we were just doing some numbers. Of course, it's very qualitative. We don't know how we were being ranked. But when we were looking at we were reading through how it will happen. If we are able to spend this 5 trillion, it seems that at least from 80-something, we can go up to the 50th ranking and be very close already to Thailand and Indonesia. Very subjective because we don't know how the weights are, but at least it's something to shoot for. I don't think we can be in the upper 20s, but with the amount of push that the private sector can have, when we go to the next slide, supporting the government, right? Because the government, of course, has its say, but that's why we have the brains in this group. That's why we have the chief economist. That's why we have Bobby and everybody else and this distinguished panel. But we ourselves, we will continue to invest, led by people like Eric over here, who's making sure that we can invest, we can build, but also we tell the government where are the bottlenecks. And if we can improve all of those, I guess my wish is that at least in the lifetime of my children, they see a better Philippines. So thank you very much.
Thank you, future Secretary Francisco. Anyway, good afternoon to everyone. The Philippine Public-Private Partnership, or PPP program, launched in September 2010, was launched in 2010 following the issuance of EO8. And it renamed the Build, Operate, Transfer Center to Public-Private Partnership Center, the PPP Center. Our first ever pipeline consisted of 10 projects, it's in your screen, selected from the priority infrastructure projects of various implementing agencies. A thorough review of these projects' feasibility studies and the sponsoring implementing agencies' capacity to tender these projects as a PPP was subsequently undertaken. The PPP Center identified a range of requisites before seeking approval from the Investment Coordination Committee, Cabinet Committee, and the National Economic Development Authority Board. Thereafter, the PPP Center, along with concerned government agencies and industry stakeholders, embarked on laying the core foundations for a credible working PPP program, which means setting up the appropriate legal and regulatory framework, streamlining the PPP procurement processes, building a robust PPP pipeline, and capacitating relevant PPP players. After the first project, the Daang-Hari South Luzon Expressway Link Road, or what is now known Muntinlupa-Cavite Expressway, was rolled out and successfully tendered in 2011, the crucial learnings from this experience were analyzed and became valuable inputs towards concretizing certain mechanisms in streamlining project processing and creating clear governance and accountability measures. Relevant PPP laws and regulatory requirements were reviewed, and the government immediately pursued the amendment of the implementing rules and regulations of the amended BOT law in October 2012, allowing it to be more responsive to the current needs of the market then. During this period, the PPP Center established and administered the Project Development and Monitoring Facility, or the PDMF, a revolving fund which serves as the anchor mechanism of the PPP program by facilitating the development of a pipeline of well-structured and bankable projects. Recognizing the complexity of PPP transactions and the multidisciplinary expertise required to successfully tender PPP projects, the PDMF enabled the engagement of reputable consulting firms to support the agencies in the development and implementation of their projects. The momentum in developing PPP projects continued in 2012 with the awarding of the second PPP project, the PPP for School Infrastructure Phase 1 of the DepEd, and the rolling out of 8 projects, 7 of which obtained support from the PDMF. Executive Order 136, signed in May 2013, further strengthened the program by creating the Ppp Governing Board as the government's central policy-making body for PPP matters. The PPP-GB consists of the following: the NEDA as the chair, DOF as the vice chair, and the members, DBM, DOJ, DTI, Office of the President, and the co-chairman of the National Competitiveness Council, the private co-chair. As one of the board's initial key decisions, it approved and adopted the new appraisal process for PPP projects. Pursuant to this policy, a technical working group composed of NEDA for social economic appraisal, DOF for financial appraisal, the DNR for environmental impact analysis, and the PPP Center for Value for Money analysis was created on November 12, 2013. The PPP Center also acts as lead of the technical working group, facilitating detailed review of the projects with these relevant government agencies. The new appraisal process was later confirmed by the ICC, and the PPP Center was designated to act as the ICC Secretariat for PPP projects. Parallel to this initiative, the PPP Center continued formulating and advocating key policies that aim to address the limitations of the current legal framework. A number of policy circulars were created and approved by the Ppp Governing Board in 2014, namely the pipeline development, viability gap funding, PPP best practices, termination payments regime, and material adverse government action regime. A PPP manual for the national government agencies was later published online to guide the IAs on the intricacies of the PPP cycle. The government, through the DOF and the Bureau of Treasury, also established the inclusion of the Contingent Liability Fund in the annual General Appropriations Act, creating a redress for the government's non-performance of its obligations under a PPP contract. An extensive capacity building program for national government agencies and local government units was likewise initiated to build PPP competencies critical in developing and implementing well-structured projects. Government-owned and controlled corporations and regional line agencies were also included in the capacity building program. Moreover, as part of the government's efforts to encourage foreign players to invest in the country's PPP, the government conducted several investment roadshows in major cities in Japan, Singapore, Germany, Spain, Belgium, France, United Kingdom, United States of America, Canada, and Australia. By end of 2014, owing to the successful implementation of the above key initiatives, the projects in the pipeline grew to 51. From 2010 until 2015, the Aquino administration has awarded 12 PPP contracts worth $217.42 billion, or approximately about $5 billion, more than the combined 6 solicited projects awarded during the past administrations. The PPP Center, together with several implementing agencies, is now in the process of actively tendering 14 projects, with 10 bids expected to be received in the first quarter of this year. The Center is also currently focusing on the passage of the PPP Act, or the amendments to the BOT law. This is a critical legislation that aims to institutionalize PPP policies, regulatory frameworks, and process improvements, cementing the sustainability of the gains that have been achieved thus far. With respect to awards and recognitions, the country has been recognized by the Economist Infrascope study as the most improved country in Asia-Pacific for PPP readiness, based on its 2014 report. The Philippines progressed from being classified as an emerging PPP market in 2011 to a developed PPP market alongside countries like Korea, Japan, and India. The study highlighted the improved PPP regulatory and institutional framework as a result of significant regulatory reforms in the recent years, new bidding and selection procedures, and better dispute resolution mechanism. The PPP Center's capacity building program that improved the skills of agencies was also recognized. It also noted that the strong political and leadership support of the Aquino administration in pursuing PPPs has contributed to the success. The international PPP community began to take stock of the country's ability to tender projects with a short listing of the DepEd's Classroom Project, the Phase 1, as Best Pathfinder Project in the United Kingdom Partnerships Bulletin Awards in 2013. The following year, the PPP Center was recognized as the Best Central Government PPP Promoter. For the year 2015, PPP Center was shortlisted again by Partnerships Bulletin as Best Central Regional Government PPP Promoter. Other nominations received include the Best Education Project for the PCIP Phase 2 and the Best Transit Projects for the Mactan Cebu International Airport, New Passenger Terminal Building, and the Automatic Fare Collection System projects. The PPP Center was recently recognized by two international award-giving bodies. The IJ Global, an international infrastructure journal, awarded the center as the 2015 Asia-Pacific Grantor of the Year in recognition of its role as a government body that advises awarding authorities on the procurement of infrastructure projects. The Asset and International Finance magazine also recognized the center as 2015's Asia's PPP Agency of the Year for advancing the implementation of the PPP program. The government's 2015 PPP pipeline is composed of 53 projects amounting to about 1.2 trillion pesos. While this pipeline continues to grow, challenges and bottlenecks have been experienced during the various stages of the project cycle. Mandated to facilitate the development and implementation of the projects, the PPP Center, together with other key partners in government, remained proactive and continued to adopt measures to address these delays and ensure the timely implementation of projects. For awarded PPP projects, delays in implementation are primarily caused by challenges in right-of-way acquisition, including alignment issues, resettlement of utilities, and informal settlers. These concerns are especially evident in the cases of LRT Line 1 Cavite Extension and the NAIA Expressway Phase 2 projects. The procurement of an independent consultant for the construction phase and or operation phase of the PPP project also encountered delays. The IC is essential to ensure successful and timely delivery of projects through the provision of efficient, transparent, and fair technical services to the contracting parties. The delays are mostly due to the procedural requirements of the Republic Act 9184 or the General Procurement Act, which proved to be challenging in highly technical and complex PPP implementation requirements. Interface issues with other projects also caused delays. Improved coordination among concerned implementing agencies had to be done to address these issues. In response to these challenges, the PPP Center initiated the formulation of a policy circular on monitoring framework and protocol. The Ppp Governing Board approved this policy, which aims to clearly define the roles and responsibilities of each stakeholder, monitor contract compliance of all parties involved, identify issues that impede implementation, and enhance the reporting process and documentations of lessons learned in implementing PPPs. In addition, the Economic Development Cluster supported the creation of a subcommittee on PPP projects execution to ensure the smooth implementation of PPP projects and facilitate timely resolution of critical issues and bottlenecks. The subcommittee is also co-chaired by the Cabinet Secretary and the Socio-Economic Planning Secretary, with PPP Center as the Secretariat. Notwithstanding all the identified delays and challenges, the Philippine government was still able to ensure the timely procurement of PPP projects comparable to the procurement timelines of other developed PPP markets. It takes an average of about 22 months from advertisement or publication of the instructions to pre-qualify and bid to start of construction of PPP projects. With the passage of the PPP Act, we are optimistic that we could further reduce the PPP procurement timeline to be at par with Canada and Australia. It will also mitigate, if not totally remove, roadblocks to project implementation. This sums up my PPP report. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Undersecretary Canilao. No doubt infrastructure will be the battle cry today, tomorrow, and in the next 6 years of the next administration. We would be remiss if we did not recognize the one person who set it into motion. So if you read the editorial in the Inquirer yesterday, it says that the headline says, PPP's big loss. Ladies and gentlemen, can I invite you to give Cosette Canilao a very big hand for a job well done under very difficult, strenuous, demanding circumstances. Cosette, another, please, another round of applause. Now that we have toasted you, it is time to roast you. We will ask you the difficult questions that you have raised. Ladies and gentlemen, before I proceed, I have 3, maybe 4 observations. First, we celebrated EDSA, 30 years of EDSA last Thursday. And it came to mind that when EDSA occurred, I was 30 years old, I'm aging myself, and I was just beginning my professional career. And all of a sudden, in the blink of an eye, it's 30 years later, and my professional career is in the afternoon of its life. My message to all of you, especially those who are very, very young, is that we all have only 30 years to do what has to be done. We only have 30 years to do the most important things in our lives. After that, the rest slides into memory and history. So that's why the first thing is that this government did not seem to have that sense of urgency. They thought 6 years will come by very, very slowly. Well, ladies and gentlemen, 6 years have come and are going. And soon we will find ourselves, short of breath, trying to catch up with our infrastructure projects. Second observation, all morning we've been saying in the next government, when the next government sits down, we are creating again false hopes that only government can do something about what our problems are. Let's get this out of the way. Let's let the private sector take the initiative. Don't wait for government to get its act together. It will take 6 months before the new cabinet will learn the ropes, another 6 months for them to find out where the money is coming and where the money can be made. And before that, it's already 4 years left in the new administration. I agree with Dr. Ben Jokno. We need a 6-year action plan. 3, he said, we need good leaders. But when a cabinet secretary is only paid 90,000 pesos a month as his monthly allowance or salary, it makes you wonder, what kind of good people, men and women, can we attract when we only pay them peanuts? You get monkeys. Okay? So, again, you talk about competition. Dr. Habito talked about the competition law. But already, the new Competition Council is bearing its fangs. Any merger and acquisition reaching or breaching 1 billion pesos will be investigated for collusive practices. 1 billion pesos is only $20 million. That's less than 1/10 of one power plant, which I am familiar with. And already you'll be taken to court and hailed to court for being uncompetitive. I think the person should be corrected. Nonetheless, I think we need to start our discussion. We have a very distinguished panel. Let me start the ball rolling. It took me an hour and a half to get here from Katipunan, Ateneo. So let's take on our expert, Ed C. An hour and a half to get from Quezon City to this place. Ed, if you were offered the post of traffic czar, will you accept the position, and what kind of initiatives will you take?
The name is Eddie Yap. I'm the map governor for traffic this year. And the answer is no, because this pay is so slow. So You mentioned 80,000? No, but that's just more a joke. But it's like this. I have been asked when the automobile industry came out with its regular announcement that vehicle sales are hitting record high and that weather traffic will get worse. Well, I said that it will get worse only if government doesn't do anything about traffic. But if government acts, and there are so many things that government can do. MAP, for instance, came out with a position paper, the holistic plan for traffic. And there are so many measures that we have identified.
It got good traction. People read about it. People congratulated you for it. What happened to your plan?
MON, for instance, did. And in fact, a few days after we presented it at the Peninsula, and it was covered by media extensively, the first cabinet meeting, 6 days later, the President issued directive. And those directives hewed very closely to the recommendations of MAP. So they help, but they are not enough. More has to be done. In fact, there are so many low-hanging fruits that can still be done. For instance, during the time of Secretary Ping de Jesus, he increased the efficiency of EDSA as the main thoroughfare of Metro Manila. Now, years afterwards, we did the reverse. For instance, C5 is supposed to be a highway, and yet we built so many traffic clogging intersections. Recently, a new one was put up at C5 and McKinley Hills. So, it is this situation wherein there is no concerted plan of action that's why we are in this situation. But it's not hopeless.
We have 6 years to do something. In the next 6 years, what do you want to happen? What do you want started and hopefully completed in the next 6 years? Of all the things that you have talked about and thought about and deliberated about, what 2 or 3 projects do you want in place within the next 6 years?
It's not all infrastructure, I would say so. First of all, management is very important. And we are management practitioners in the MAP. Now, traffic management, the 3 E's that Secretary Gary Tevez mentioned, that we emphasize in our plan. Enforcement, education, those are management matters. It does not require heavy investment, and it can be done immediately. So those are the 2 of the 3 E's. Okay? Now, we would like to see better enforcement. We would like to see better education so that drivers will be more disciplined. Now, on infrastructure, there are 2 things. One is that what are called as tweakings or refinements, okay, of engineering. And you have seen the traffic barriers being installed on EDSA, the yellow ones. Those are part of our recommendation. So it's channelizing our road, it is making traffic more efficient. Now, what I would like to see, okay, one key recommendation that we put in our plan is to eliminate all those intersections on C5 and on the radial roads such as Shaw Boulevard, Ortigas, P. Tuason. You know, the focus should not be on EDSA alone, but should include all of those radial roads because they are needed for circulation. You need those roads to get to EDSA. You need those roads to get away from EDSA. Unless those roads are rendered more efficient, all the vehicles will be trapped on EDSA. So those are the simple things that we would like to see done, not tomorrow, but yesterday.
Okay. Eric, Ayala Corp has been tagged as a Johnny-come-lately, but in the last 4 or 5 years, you have come roaring back and invested in a lot of different projects. Do you have a master plan? Does Ayala Corp have a master plan? Or do you do it on a case-to-case basis? What is your thinking about the next 6 years?
Yeah, Alan, thank you. We'd like to think that we've been in the infrastructure business decades ago now, especially with Manila Water and Globe Telecom. And the first part of this millennium, 2000 to 2010, yes, we focused on existing assets. But I think the Aquino administration, what they have brought to the table is the focus on transparency and level playing field and the push on infrastructure. And obviously the excellent environment, especially the financial markets, so the excellent credit rating, the liquidity and so forth, created an environment conducive for private sector to invest. And it's in the DNA of Ayala Corp to focus on nation building and take a long-term view. There is no master plan per se, but I would like to say that we would be extremely supportive and hopeful that the next administration will continue the path, the focus on the level playing field, the good governance and the transparency and the push on infrastructure. So to give you an idea, we did commit already over $1 billion from Ayala Corp's balance sheet over the last 5 years. We initially set out the plan in 2010. If you included our partners' equity and leverage, that translates to about $6 or $7 billion worth of projects across power and transport infrastructure. To give you a little bit of texture, at first, in 2010, when PPP was kicked off, we thought that it would be split 50-50 between energy and transport infrastructure. But where we stand today, it ended up being 75% power, 25% transport infrastructure. The key difference being power is largely private sector led. You don't have to wait for bidding and so forth. But on the transport infrastructure side, because of the monopolistic nature, it has to be bid out competitively, and it does take time. And the issues are far more complex, right-of-way and other such matters that Cosette and Ed mentioned earlier. No. So, but yeah, we do plan to continue investments, although later on we'll talk about the barriers to that as well, given also the respect for contracts and other obstacles.
Yeah,
like
I wanted to talk
issues.
to you about the issue about water rates, because the other water company has been slapped down by the MWSS in its bid to raise its tariffs under the contract that it signed many years ago. Is that bothering you? Is that going to deter your group from investing further in the water sector all over the country?
Well, it does bother us, and not only us, but also other investors, both local and foreign. I'll be honest, Alan. No? In our discussion, and not only on water infrastructure, but this has a ripple effect on infrastructure in general. It doesn't deter us per se, from making further investments, but you really get to think 3 times, 4 times, and it's not as easy to convince the board any longer to commit investments in various projects. So we've decided to throw our hat in the ring in the Bulacan bulk water, for example. So that came after the water debacle. But again, the upshot is we'll be very, very extremely selective in the infrastructure projects that we carry out. And the bar is so much higher in terms of justifying projects.
Do you have funds for the new rail system that's being contemplated, that's going to be bid out? Are you interested in extending the rail system all over Luzon and even parts of Mindanao and the Visayas?
Yeah, well, there is a couple of really large rail infrastructure projects that Cosette's team and DOTC have been preparing, no? Particularly the PNR, South Rail, North-South Rail connection. That's a very ambitious project, very large. There's also LRT-6, which is a natural extension of Line 1 Cavite extension. So both are interesting, but again, both are large and complex, and I believe that we would have to do it in a consortium. We would not put our balance sheet at risk or strain it given the relative size of these projects. No? You don't just look at it from an equity side, you also look at it from a debt side. And again, there is a natural limit to the local banks. While there's a strong liquidity and we've got really strong banks, when you get to the $3-4 billion magnitude of projects, I would argue you would really need foreign participation both on the debt and the equity side. So we need to address that as well, how to attract these foreign investors. There's a lot of buzz in investing in the Philippines, but if you look at the reality, it falls short of expectations.
Well, talking about banks, let's talk to Ed. Ed, we know BDO is awash in cash, and you've been pushing your cash out the door, hoping to finance PPP projects. The observation was made, I think, by Dr. Jokno and Dr. Abito, that we're always catering to the usual suspects. We have 51 other projects in the pipeline for PPP, costing about 1.3 trillion pesos or dollars, Cosette? Pesos. Is there a second tier of Filipino investors who are capable and willing and able to take on your debt and to participate in these very big ticket projects? Or are you, again, looking at the usual top 5 or 6 groups or companies who usually participate in PPP projects?
Thanks, Alan. Just a quick answer. Effectively, when we look at the projects, we look at them as standalone projects anyway, and that's how the BSP wants us to look at them. We would support these projects because we believe in the viability and the cash flows that these will generate. So in general, as long as the winning proponents have the capabilities and have the management and the operations, we generally would like to finance whoever wins. So it's not, so that means that whether it's be the top 5, it's okay, but even if it's the next 5, next 10, or if it's going to be all foreign, if it's a well thought out project, why shouldn't we lend to that, right?
Agreed. But what is your sense of the depth of the Philippine market?
Okay. Now, in terms of the debt on the equity side, the next tier, there are many next tier conglomerates and families wanting to get in. I guess they just don't have the expertise yet because maybe we can ask Eric and the rest. But yeah, to do a PPP project, you have to hire the consultants, you spend a lot of time. So you have to have you're effectively your PPP or infra team working on it. So it's not just something that you invested.
Okay. Cosette, have you encountered this notion that you're usually have the same winners? One group has won 4 of the first 5 PPP projects. Are they going to bid some more and dominate some more? Is there a sense of distributing the pie and so that others will be allowed to come in?
We do want new players to come in and participate in the PPP program. So Megawide is actually a big surprise and a welcome surprise for as a new player. But like what Ed said earlier, we have to demystify PPPs. We have to, the service providers, the consultants, transaction advisors, both for technical, legal, and financial advisors, should be able to, the new player should be able to tap the right advisors to participate, effectively participate in a PPP project.
Are you able to provide assistance in that regard now?
Well, the PPP Center, we are a government agency, but we do conduct a briefing for the private sector, for the new players who want to know more about the processes, the timelines, and the projects that we have in the pipeline. We've done that since from the start, and we're doing that, and we hope that more next year conglomerates or companies to take the leap of faith and participate in the PPP program.
Isn't that part of the new draft law that you are putting in place? You want to set up a fund so that the initial pre-feasibility studies can be conducted because this is the initial stumbling block.
Yes, for our PPP projects, we do have what I mentioned earlier, the Project Development and Monitoring Facility, or the PDMF, which implementing agencies tapped to procure consultants and transaction advisors to prepare the feasibility studies. But normally, even though we have the study, the bidders would still conduct their own due diligence. They would still conduct their own traffic projections, technical study, and then the rest. So it will be good if they trust our feasibility studies and base their projections on that. But most of the time, bidders would have to do their own study.
Okay. Jesse, what is the current view of the multilateral institutions? They're more or less bullish, no? But long term, are you confident that we can surmount the challenges, right of way, funding, good partners, and everything else?
Well, I think, first of all, looking at infrastructure more broadly, I think Philippines has to look at and use all the tools that it has. Traditionally in the Philippines, because coming from the Marcos era, we have a deficit. So we have tended to use PPPs or private sector to help us do infrastructure. In fact, President Ramos, who I think is still there, he started it all by doing the IPPs of the 1990s, right? But today, because of what this government has done, with a much better macro situation that we have today, as evidenced by the investment grade that we have obtained, and now much higher than investment grade, now 2 notches above, I think the government now is in the position to consider its own resources so that it can then do infrastructure. By the way, most of infrastructure in the world is done by government. All you have to do is look at China, which is the most successful infrastructure developer in the world. In the last 30 years, most of that's done by government. So I think here, for various reasons, we have used the private sector model, the PPPs. So I think here the government needs to consider and look at perhaps increasing more, because again, our spending in infra is very low. We're trying to get up to 5%. That's not enough. We need to do more. And maybe on a combined basis, reach 10%, both private and public. So for us, so while we're very bullish about the Philippines, we still need to do a lot more in the infrastructure side, expand it some more, and maybe looking at the tools that government has, okay, in terms of what resources it has today, maybe on a combined basis, and then start using all those tools to do all the infra projects that we need to do.
Before I get to Carl, yesterday or the other day, I read an article, a column by former Undersecretary Romy Bernardo, who is one of the advisors to one of the presidential candidates. He was saying that if we want to elevate our infrastructure spending from 5% to just 7%, we need to collect another 1 trillion pesos in taxes in order to accommodate this increase. What do you think? What do you think, Ed? Is this a viable outlook, or are we relying too much on government taxation to finance our infra projects?
Well, again, it's a matter of priorities, right? Definitely, traditionally in the past, we had difficulties keeping our deficit below 3%. Today, 2% is easy, right? We have to reduce our debt stock from 60% of GDP to 40%. So I think we have room. Now, the government has used it. It has increased health more than 2 times. It has increased education more than 2 times, even though they're still low levels. There must be room for some more infrastructure that needs to come in. I'm not saying that we necessarily change what we're doing. All I'm saying is we need to consider maybe using some government resources. So maybe things like the subway, right? That maybe, because the subway may be very expensive to do and stuff like that, maybe we can consider doing that, but maybe putting more government subsidy to that, so that thing can finally happen in Metro Manila.
Ed, you want to take that on?
Yeah, no, I agree. That's why when we're looking at some of our slides, some projects should be done by the government, but they might not be anymore with the private sector because the viability gap might be too much, or they really have to be subsidized. But I guess that's part of the growth process. We have the fiscal space now, so let's use it. It's too bad.
Yes, Cosette, please.
Yeah, but in a PPP, there's what we call an availability payment, wherein the government fully pays for the services that the private sector will provide. Like, for example, in the subway, the way in the North-South Railway project, the way we structure this is more than half of the total project cost will be repaid via availability payments, meaning amortization payments from the government. And that's how we use the government's balance sheet to produce this infrastructure project while we get the private sector while we harness the private sector's innovation and technology that they bring.
Okay, thank you. Carl, you're with the power sector. One of the bright spots of this administration is the solution to the power shortage. What do you think? Do we have a long way to go? Is there something else we need to do? And what are the other infrastructure projects that you think should be in place?
The power issue is an interesting one. I think you could use an example in Metro Manila about the load sharing program that occurred over the last summer. That was we had a real shortage of generation in Metro Manila, and it was critical. The place was going to stop, and the powers that be got organised. They put a very innovative strategy together. They planned it and they implemented it, and there was good execution, and there were no brownouts. Now we may have to do it again this summer. I'm not sure, but there's no reason why we can't do that in other infrastructure. It's like the trigger point has to be catastrophe before people get organised, and the trigger point should be, well, we just want it better, and because we've proven that we can do it. It was very effective. In terms of transport infrastructure, it's something that I've been involved in my whole career, and it's different from all other infrastructure in that people have an opinion. Everyone has an opinion on it. The power, people generally don't understand how it works. They don't understand where it comes from. It's either on or it's off, you pay for it. Comms, exactly the same thing. Your phone works or it doesn't, you pay for it. Water, again, same. Sewer, even worse. It either stays there or it disappears. They don't really understand it. And flood control is the same. But transport, everyone touches it on a daily basis. Everyone walks, rides, catches a bus, drives, and they all look at it in their own little perspective. And everyone, from the man sweeping the street to the taxi driver, to the lady going to work, to the president, has an opinion on what should happen with transport. And the truly own effective way is a plan, and stick to the plan. And we have a great plan for Metro Manila. The JICA Dream Plan, as it's called, is a great plan. It's a balance between road and public transport. And I'm sure it's not perfect, but it's a plan that needs to be legislated and stuck to. Industry can plan, Eric can plan what he's going to bid for. We can all get organised and work through it with PPPs, with everything. Industry needs stability.
Well, thank you, Carl. This is directed at Eddie, Eric, and Cosette. I have a question here. Is there a quick fix to the MRT EDSA problem? Or is this going to be a lingering headache for the next 6 years? Can we expect Ayala investment in improving the MRT system? Can we connect the MRT3 to the other LRTs? Is there something we can do? Or should you just, wail and cry and gnash our teeth in the next 6 years? Eric?
I think MRT3 were, at least from where I sit, my understanding is there are new LRVs coming from China. So it's only a matter of time when new capacity, which it badly needs, will be in place, and this will help massively the MRT3 situation. The other element is the connectivity between MRT3 and LRT1. That's a longer story, but there is coordination happening to make it work among all related parties. So I'm still hopeful that that will be resolved soon for the benefit of the public.
it can be seen that this administration is sending different signals. Hello? Yeah. This administration is sending different signals. In fact, I would say contradictory. In the case of LRT-1, it is privatizing the line by awarding it to the Ayala Consortium, right? But in the case of the MRT-3, it wants to take over. Okay? So that's contradictory. Now, I would say that we have seen how government works and the inefficiencies that goes with it. Now, it's about time that there should be a consistent policy. If we want to privatize, then privatize all the way. And hands off MRT3, allow private sector to do its job. If there is a need to renegotiate, then do so. For instance, I was about to say this, because when we talk of infrastructure, it is unavoidable that we touch on the issue of return to investors. I think one of the grounds cited by the administration in desiring to get back MRT3 is the high rate of return. I understand it's 15%, fixed at 15%. Now, we have seen that over the last decade, interest rates have gone down to the seller. We have seen WACC, the weighted average of cost of capital and credit, gone down to record lows. Now, if a particular concession is granted at a high rate, double digit, which at the time was the prevailing rate anyway, but then shouldn't, I think this should be directed at Cosette, no? Shouldn't concession contracts be structured in such a way that the rate of returns will be more flexible and that it will hew more closely to WACC?
Cosette, you have the last word. We have 40 seconds.
MRT3 is a very complicated contract. First of all, it was securitized. So the 15%, the rate of return, the cash flows of MRT3 were already securitized and owned by several parties. So there were issues like that. Hence, the government couldn't negotiate or renegotiate the rate of return. However, we've learned a lot from that contract, and in our new contracts right now, it's a parametric formula, and that mimics the current conditions, the WACC. So, MRT, as I understand, the DOTC, and I saw Chairman Hinas here, they have several programs to ease traffic and along EDSA. They have the LRVs will start arriving in April, and I think they've just rolled out since December the point-to-point buses, and it's now gaining traction, and that gives commuters an alternative to MRT3. So there's still a lot to be done by this government to ease the commute time of along EDSA, and hopefully, as we roll out new projects and programs, and as private cars, as we learn how to carpool, then congested roads, then hopefully there'll be less congestion.
Thank you, Cosette. That ends our session on modernizing infrastructure. I hope you all learned a lot. We have a lot more to talk about, but that's for another session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. May we ask our panelists to please come forward for a souvenir photo. Okay, thank you so much to our panelists, our speaker, and our moderator. Now let's talk about becoming more competitive. Our fifth panel will be introduced by the Executive Director of the American Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, Mr. Eb Hinchcliffe. Let's give him a big hand.